Hello, and welcome to the Deerfield Public Library Twitch channel. I'm Anne, and today we are going to continue our journey through the tale of Genji. So last time, things took a turn. Things took a twist and took a turn. So Genji was involved in an emotional affair with this young woman, and he made a fatal error, which was turning it physical, and he basically kidnapped her. Let's not beat around the bush. He kidnapped her, and he took her to an abandoned palace property so that they could have some alone time. And while they were there, it turns out this place was haunted, and a ghost showed up, and the ghost, spoiler alert, was super into Genji as well, because everyone is. And the ghost killed the girl that he had kidnapped and taken over there. We also found out that this girl was, in fact, his brother-in-law's long-lost love, and there was a child. And so Genji decided that the perfect thing to do was adopt this daughter and not tell anyone. He also basically covers up the murder. He has his bestie take the body somewhere else to be burned, and he's just really, really sad, and he basically gets sick for like a month with how sad he is that this girl that he kidnapped died. And yeah, like that was what happened. It started out kind of more fun, like, ooh, will they, won't they? And then a ghost shows up and does a murder. Consequences to the actions. Will Genji learn anything? Let's find out today. We are reading chapter 5, Waka Murasaki, Young Murasaki. So waka means young, while a murasaki is a plant whose roots yield a purple dye. It means also the dye and its color. In poetry, murasaki purple stands for close relationships and lasting passions. In this chapter, Genji comes across a little girl very like Fujitsubo. She's Fujitsubo's niece, who to him is murasaki, and whom he immediately wants for himself. How glad I would be to pick and soon to make mine that little wild plant sprung up from the very root shared by the Murasaki. Murasaki comes in time to refer to the girl herself and to work more or less as her name, because none of the women are actually named. So young Murasaki begins in the spring when Genji is 18, and while the Twilight Beauty, which was the previous chapter, ends late in the previous year, but there's little narrative link between them. Genji, who was suffering from a recurrent fever, had all sorts of spells cast and healing rites done, but to no avail. The fever kept returning. Someone then said, "My lord, there's a remarkable aesthetic at a temple in the northern hills. Last summer, when the fever was widespread and spells failed to help, he healed many people immediately. Please try him soon. It would be dangerous to allow your fever to become any worse." Genji sent for him, but the ascetic answered that, being now old and bent, he never left his cave. "Then I shall have to go very quietly to see him." He set off before daybreak with only 4 or 5 especially close retainers. The place was a little ways into the mountains. The blossoms in the city were gone now, since it was late in the 3rd month, but in the mountains the cherry trees were in full bloom, and the further he went, the lovelier the veils of mist became, until for him, whose rank so restricted travel that all this was new, the landscape became a source of wonder. The temple impressed him as well. The holy man lived near a high peak amid forbidding rocks. Genji climbed there without announcing who he was, and quite plainly dressed, but there was no mistaking him. "Ah, this is too great an honor," the holy man exclaimed in great agitation. "You must be the gentleman who desired my presence the other day. I have lost all interest in this world by now, and I have given up my healing practices altogether. What has brought you all this way, my lord?" He smiled as his eyes rested upon Genji. Once again, Genji being the hottest person alive, works in his favor. "He proved to be a most saintly man. The sun rose high in the sky while he made the necessary talismans, had Genji swallow them, and proceeded with the rite. When Genji went outside a moment and examined his surroundings, he found himself on a height directly overlooking the monks' lodges. At the foot of a steeply twisting path, and surrounded, like the lodges but more neatly, by a brushwood fence, there stood a pretty house, set with galleries in a handsome grove. "Who lives there?" he asked. "That, my lord, is where I gather his reverence has been secluded these last 2 years." So his reverence is an ecclesiastic of high rank and a nobleman himself, and therefore not someone Genji would want to be seen improperly dressed, and the text avoids naming him, so we don't know exactly who he is. "It certainly is the place for someone of a retiring nature. What a pity I am so inadequately dressed. He is certain to find out I am here." Genji clearly saw several nice-looking page girls come out to offer holy water, gather flowers, and so on. "Why, there is a woman living there," his companions exclaimed to one another. "Surely his reverence would not have one with him. Who can she be?" Some went down to peer at the house. They reported having seen some nice-looking little girls, young gentlewomen, and page girls. Genji was wondering, as the sun rose towards noon and he continued the rite, how his fever would now behave, when one of his men remarked, "Instead of just worrying, my lord, you should somehow get your mind off of the matter." And so Genji went onto the mountain behind the temple and looked out towards the city. Mist veiled the landscape into the distance, and the budding trees everywhere were as though swathed in smoke. "It all looks just like a painting," he said. "No one living here could wish for more." "But my lord, this is nothing yet. How much more beautiful your painting would be if only you had before your eyes the mountains and seas of other provinces." Someone else extolled Mount Fuji and another peak. Then they went on to divert him further by describing the lovely seaside villages and rocky shores of the provinces of the west. Among places less far away, I think the coast at Akashi and Harima deserves special mention. Not that any single feature of it is so extraordinary, but the view over the sea there is somehow more peaceful than elsewhere. A former governor of the province, a gentleman who has now taken up the religious life and who is looking very carefully after his daughter, had an impressive establishment there. He ought to have done well in the world because he is descended from a minister, but being eccentric, he never mixed with society, resigned his post as a captain of the palace guards, and requested his posting as governor himself. He became a bit of a laughing-stock in his province even so, and he was too embarrassed to return to the city, so he shaved his head instead. Not that he retired to any sheltered spot in the hills, because he put himself right on the sea, which is rather strange. It is certainly true, though, that while the province offers many places suitable for retirement, a village deep in the mountains would have been miserably lonely for his wife and his young daughter. And besides, I expect he felt more comfortable there himself. When I was down in the province some time ago, I went for a look at his residence. He may never have made a place for himself in the city, but the sheer scale of the tract he has claimed makes it obvious that he has arranged things. He was the governor, after all, so as to spend the rest of his life in luxury. He does all his devotions to prepare for the life to come, and in fact he makes a better monk than he ever did a gentleman. "Yes," said Genji, "but what about his daughter?" Of course, Genji really doesn't care about the guys. All he cares about is the ladies. "My lord, I gather she has her share both of looks and of character. I hear one governor after another has respectfully shown interest in her, but her father rejects each one. It is all very well for me to have sunk this low," he says, "but she is all I have, and I have other things in mind for her. If you outlive me," he tells her, "if my hopes for you fail, and the future I want for you is not to be, then you are to drown yourself in the sea." Reasonable. So reasonable. If I can't make a good marriage for you and I die before you, just go ahead and drown yourself. That, they say, is the solemn injunction he repeats to her. Genji was indeed amused. "She must be a rare treasure then," someone said, laughing, "if her father means the Dragon King of the Sea to have her as his queen. Spare me such high ambition." The young man who had been telling about her, a son of the present governor, had risen this year to the rank above chamberlain. "You're enterprising enough in love," one of them said. "You'd like to break her father's solemn injunction yourself, wouldn't you?" "Oh yes, I'm sure he's always lurking around her house." "Get on with you. She must be a country girl, whatever you say. Look at where she grew up, after all, and with no one but her ancient parents to teach her anything." No, her mother seems to be of excellent birth. Thanks to her relations, she manages to get pretty young gentlewomen and page girls from the best families in the city, and she is bringing up her daughter in grand style. He would not feel so safe about having her there if the governor assigned to the province happened to be unscrupulous. I wonder what it means that his ambitions for her reach all the way to the bottom of the sea, Genji mused. It cannot be much fun down there with all the seaweed. He was keenly intrigued. His marked taste for the unusual ensured that he would remember her story, as his companions clearly noted. Your fever seems not to have flared up today, my lord, even though the sun will soon be setting. You should start back. But the venerable monk demurred. My lord, you seem also to have come under the influence of a spirit, and I prefer that we quietly continue our rites tonight before you return. Ghost sickness. That's what this is. He's sick from the ghost. All approved. Genji was pleased too, since he had never spent the night away like this before. Very well, I shall start at dawn. For want of better to do during what remained of the long day, he melted into the heavy twilight mists towards the brushwood fence that had caught his eye. He then sent the others back and peered through the fence with Lord Koremitsu. There she was, straight before him on the west side of the house, engaged in practice before her personal Buddha, a nun. The blinds were a little way up, and she seemed to be making a flower offering. She was leaning against a pillar with her scripture text on an armrest before her, and chanting with obvious difficulty, and she was plainly of no common distinction. Past 40 and very thin, with elegantly white skin, she nonetheless still had a roundness to her cheeks, fine eyes, and hair so neatly cut that to Genji it seemed much more pleasingly modern in style than if it had been long. 2 handsome grown-up women and some page girls were wandering in and out of the room. In among them came running a girl of 10 or so, wearing a softly rumpled Keria rose layering over a white gown, and unlike the other children, an obvious future beauty. Wow, rude Genji. These other kids don't look as pretty, apparently. Her hair cascaded like a spread fan behind her as she stood there, her face all red from crying. What is the matter? The nun glanced up at her. Have you quarreled with one of the girls? They looked so alike that Genji took them for mother and daughter. Inuki let my baby sparrow go, and I had him in his cage and everything, declared the indignant little girl. So that silly creature has managed to earn herself another scolding. She is hopeless, a grown-up said. And where did he go? He had grown to be such a dear little thing. Oh, she went on, rising to leave, I hope the crows do not get him. She was a fine-looking woman with very nice long hair. Apparently she was in charge of the girls, since the others seemed to call her Nurse Shonagon. Oh, come, you are such a baby, the nun protested. You understand nothing, do you? Here I am wondering whether I will last out this day or the next, but that means nothing to you, does it? All you do is chase sparrows. Oh dear, and I keep telling you it is a sin. Come here. The little girl sat down. She had a very dear face, and the faint arc of her eyebrows, the forehead from which she had childishly swept back her hair, and the hairline itself were extremely pretty. She is the one I would like to see when she grows up, Genji thought, fascinated. Weird vibes, Genji. Weird vibes as always. Indeed, he wept when he realized that it was her close resemblance to the lady who claimed all his heart that made it impossible for him to take his eyes off her. So if I'm remembering correctly, this little girl is the niece of the girl who was killed by a ghost. Could be wrong. It could be the girl who was like, I'm not into you and I'm going to run away from you. There's so many options. You hate even to have it combed, the nurse said, stroking the girl's hair. You hate even to have it combed, the nun said, stroking the girl's hair. But what beautiful hair it is. Your childishness really worries me, you know. Not everyone is like this at your age, I assure you. Your late mother was 10 when she lost her father, and she perfectly understood what had happened. How would you manage if I were suddenly to leave you? She wept so bitterly that the watching Genji felt a wave of sorrow too. Child though she was, the little girl observed the nun gravely, then looked down and hung her head. Her hair spilled forward as she did so, glinting with the loveliest sheen. When no one can say where it is the little plant will grow up at last, the dewdrop soon to leave her does not see how she can go, the nun said. With tears and a cry of sympathy, a woman replied, Alas, does the dew really mean to melt away before she can know where her tender little plant will at last grow to be tall? His reverence appeared from elsewhere in the house. This side seems to be open for anyone to look in. Today is not the day for you to be sitting so near the veranda. I have just learned that Captain Genji is now with the holy man higher up on the mountain seeking a cure for a recurrent fever. He came so quietly that I knew nothing about it, and despite being here, I have not even been to call on him yet. How dreadful. Here we are. Hey, by the way, there's a new guy up there. Maybe you don't want to be seen? How dreadful. Here we all are in disarray, and someone may actually have seen us. Down came the blinds. This is a chance, if you like, to see the shining Genji whose praises all the world is singing. His looks are enough to make even a renunciate monk forget his cares and feel young again. Well, I shall go and greet him." Genji heard him and returned to where he was staying. Good move, Genji. What an enchanting girl he had found. Those companions of his, so keen on women and always exploring, might indeed come across their rare finds, but he had found a treasure just on a chance outing. He was delighted. What a dear child! Who could she be? He now longed for the pleasure of having her with him day and night to make up for the absence of the lady he loved. He was lying down when a disciple of his reverence came inquiring for Koremitsu. The place was so small that he heard everything. The disciple said on behalf of his master, "I've just learned that his lordship is favoring us with a visit, and despite the suddenness of the news, I should be waiting upon his pleasure. But you see, it pains me that his lordship, who knows I am on retreat at the temple here, should have chosen nonetheless to keep his arrival a secret. I should really have offered him a poor mat in my own lodging. It is all quite upsetting." Genji replied, a little before, or through Koremitsu is the thing, so he's not actually saying, Genji's not actually talking right now. There's a lot of this where it's like, Genji and the mat and his reverence are technically talking through other people. Genji replied, "A little before the middle of this month, I began to suffer from a recurrent fever, and the severity of its repeated attacks prompted me to accept advice to come here in all haste. I have kept my visit quiet, however, because it seemed to me that it would be a shame if the intervention of so saintly a man were to fail, and that consideration for him enjoined special caution on someone like myself. I shall gladly accept if that is your wish." To Genji's embarrassment, his reverence quickly appeared. Monk though he was, his birth entitled him to society's highest esteem, and Genji's present casual dress made its wearer uncomfortable. His reverence first told Genji about his life on retreat, and then pressed his invitation. "It is only a common brushwood hut, my lord, but I would gladly show you its pleasantly cool stream." Genji blushed to think of the extravagant terms in which his host had described him to those of the household who had not yet seen him themselves, but the interest in the little girl who had so caught his fancy encouraged him to go. The place, which really was very well done, boasted the usual plants and trees. Cressets were lit along the brook, and there were lights in the lanterns, too, because at this time of the month there was no moon. The room on the south side had been nicely prepared for him. A delicious fragrance of rare incense filled the air, and Genji's own scent as he passed by was so unlike any other that those in the house must have been overawed. He even smells pretty. Can do no wrong. Smells pretty, looks pretty. Ghosts love him. Sounds like a ghosts love him due to one secret. His reverence talked of mutability and of the life to come when Genji pondered the fearfulness of his own transgression. Talked of the life to come while Genji pondered the fearfulness of his own transgression. The way in which this sinful preoccupation had driven all else from his mind, the likelihood that it would torment him all his days, and worse still, the agonies that awaited him in the hereafter. How he wished that he himself might live as did his host. But the figure he had seen by daylight still called out to him. "May I ask your reverence what lady lives here? I had a dream on which I wished to consult you, you see, and I've only just remembered it." His host smiled. "How unexpectedly your dream has entered our conversation, my lord. I am afraid that my answer will disappoint you. You probably do not know about the late Inspector Grand Counselor, because it is a long time now since he died. His widow is my sister, you see. She renounced the world after he was gone, and when recently her health began to fail, she sought refuge with me, since I myself no longer visit the city. She has secluded herself here." So that's the nun. "I had heard that the Grand Counselor's daughter was still living, though," Genji ventured. "Of course, I mean nothing frivolous. My inquiry is quite serious." "Yes, he had a daughter. It must be 10 years or more since she died. The late Grand Counselor brought her up very carefully, in the hope of offering her to His Majesty, but he passed away before he could do so, leaving the present nun to look after her as well as she could all alone. Meanwhile, someone allowed His Highness the Bureau of War to take up with her in secret. However, His Highness's wife is a very great lady, and the resulting unpleasantness made her so continually miserable that in the end she died." Again, there's a lot of it's too much, I will die now. "Oh yes, I have seen with my own eyes how someone can sicken from sheer disappointment and sorrow." Ah, Genji thought, then the girl is her daughter. I suppose it is being His Highness's too that makes her look so much like her. So His Highness the Bureau of War is Fujitsubu's older brother. So the older brother of the woman he killed. He was now more eager than ever to have her for his own. She was of distinguished parentage, she was delightful, and she showed no distressing tendency to talk back. She's 10. She's 10, he's 18, and he's already like, well, I like it when a woman doesn't talk back to me. Bad news for you, Genji. About modern women. How he would love to have her with him and bring her up as he pleased. This is once again that talk about the perfect woman. It's coming back to bite us because he literally is like, I have an idea. I will raise the perfect wife. All this sad news, he said, still keen to be certain who she was. Did the daughter leave no child to preserve her memory? Yes, she did, not long before she died. Another girl. I'm afraid she is a great worry to her grandmother, who seems extremely anxious about her as her own life draws to a close. So I was right, Genji said to himself. Please forgive me for being so forward, but would you be good enough to advise the child's grandmother to entrust her granddaughter's future to me? I have certain ideas of my own, and although there are of course ladies upon who I call, they seem not to suit me as well as they might since I live alone. You may attribute the most common intentions to me, and therefore feel she is hardly yet of a suitable age, but if so, you do me an injustice. My lord, your proposal should be very welcome, but she is still so young and innocent that I do not see how you could propose even in jest to favor her that way. At any rate, I myself can make no decision, since it is not for me to rear a girl into adulthood. I shall give you an answer after discussing the matter with her grandmother. He spoke curtly, and his young guest found the formality of his manner so forbidding that he was at a loss to reply. It is time for me to busy myself in the hall where Amida dwells, his reverence continued. I have not yet done the evening service. I shall be at your disposal once more when it is over. He went up to the hall. Genji felt quite unwell, and besides, it was now raining a little. A cold mountain wind had set in to blow, and the pool beneath the waterfall had risen until the roar was louder than before. The eerie swelling and dying of solemn voices chanting the scriptures could hardly fail in such a setting to move the most casual visitor. No wonder Genji, who had so much to ponder, could not sleep. He's just out here kidnapping another girl. His reverence had mentioned the evening service, but the night was in fact well advanced. Obviously the nun and her gentlewomen in the chamber were not asleep yet, because despite their efforts to be quiet, he could hear the click of rosary beads against an armrest, as well as a rustling of silks most pleasing to his ears. Since they were so close, he opened a gap in the line of screens that bounded his room and wrapped his fan on his palm. Though surprised, they seemed to see no point in pretending not to have heard him, for he caught the sound of a gentlewoman slipping towards him. How odd, she murmured, flustered after retreating a little. I must be hearing things. I have heard it said that even in darkness the Lord Buddha is an unerring guide, Genji began, overwhelming her with the youthful grace of his voice. A guide to what? I do not understand. So suddenly an approach on my part naturally perplexes you, but I hope that you will convey this message for me. Ever since that time I first spied the tender leaves of the little plant, the traveler's sleeves I wear are endlessly wet with dew. But my lord, no one here could possibly make anything of such a message, as you must surely know. To whom then do you wish me? Please grant me reasons of my own for expressing myself this way. The gentlewoman went back to speak to her mistress, the nun, who was both puzzled and shocked. Oh dear, she thought, he certainly is modern in his ways. He must have got it into his head that our little girl is old enough for this sort of thing. But how did he manage to hear what we were saying about the little plant? In her confusion, she failed to answer him for so long that she feared she was being uncivil. Oh, never compare dews that gather for a night on your own pillow to those that in these mountains wet many a mossy robe. Here the dew never dries. I am afraid I am a novice at conversing this way, through somebody else, Genji replied. I have something to discuss with you seriously, if you will forgive my presumption. Surely he has been misled, the nun said to her women. It is so intimidating to have him here that I do not know how to answer. But my lady, you are making him uncomfortable. Well, yes, and we all know what's the most important thing? Genji's comfort. Because he's the son of the emperor. Well, yes, I suppose it would be one thing if I were a young woman myself, but as it is, I really cannot ignore him when he is so much in earnest. She came to Genji herself. You may imagine after my abrupt approach that I am only seeking my own amusement, he began, but as the Lord Buddha surely knows, I find no such feelings in my heart. Restrained by the quiet circumspection in her manner, he could not at first get out what he had to say. Why, no, my lord. How could you assume that I may make light of your feelings, now that you and I are so unexpectedly conversing with each other? I've been pained to learn of the difficulties that your granddaughter faces, and I hope that you will kindly allow me to take the place of the mother whom I believe she has lost. I myself was very young when those who would have brought me up were taken from me, and the life I have led ever since has been a strangely rootless one. Her situation and mine are so alike that I have longed to beg you to recognize how much she and I share, and so I have seized this rare opportunity, even at the risk of offending you, to address you frankly. He's 18. And he did lose his mom quite young, but he's 18. Your words should make me glad, my lord, but caution restrains me, for I fear that in some things you may have been misinformed. There is indeed here one for whom only I am responsible, however little I may deserve it, but she is still extremely young, and since I cannot imagine how you could overlook this difficulty, I see no way to take your proposition seriously. I understand you perfectly, but I still urge you to take no narrow view of what I ask. Please consider instead the exceptional nature of my most sincere desire. However, she remained convinced that he simply did not understand the incongruity of his proposal, and her answers conceded nothing. Meanwhile, his reverence had returned. Very well, Genji reflected as he once more closed the gap between the screens. It is a relief to at least have broached the subject. Dawn was near, and the awesome voices chanting the Confession of the Lotus Meditation Hall came to them, on the wind down the mountain, mingled with the noise of the waterfall. The wandering wind blowing down the mountain slopes sweeps away the dream, and then tears begin to flow at the clamor of the falls, Genji said, and his reverence, the swift mountain stream that so much to your surprise has moistened your sleeves, stirs no trouble in a heart its waters have long washed clean. I'm just used to it, I suppose. The lightning sky was thick with mist, and mountain birds were singing everywhere. Flowers Genji could not even name carpeted the ground with a many-colored brocade of petals, on which deer now stood or wandered past, a sight so wonderful that all thought of his fever melted away. The holy man managed to perform a protective rite for him, despite his difficulty in moving about. His hoarse voice was quite indistinct, but his chanting of the Dharami conveyed an impressive sanctity. Those who had come from the city to escort Genji home now presented themselves before him, expressed their pleasure that his fever had abated, and conveyed as well his Majesty's wishes for Genji's health. His reverence scoured the depths of the valley to entertain Genji with all sorts of fruits and nuts unknown to the world at large. Alas, my lord, he remarked, offering Genji wine, my solemn vow to remain on the mountain through this year prevents me from accompanying you as I should otherwise wish to do. While my heart remains in these mountains, his Majesty's kind expressions of concern leave me no choice but to return, Genji replied. This year's blossoms shall not pass before I come again. I shall go forth now and describe to all at court these mountain cherries, that before the winds arrive they themselves should come and see. His manner of speaking and the sound of his voice were both utterly captivating. At last I have seen the Udumbara flower. That is how I feel till I have no eyes at all for mountain cherry blossoms, his reverence courteously replied. Genji smiled. What you have before you cannot be the flower of which you speak, for surely that one blooms only once and at its proper time. The holy man took up the wine cup in his turn. Having just for once opened deep in these mountains my lowly pine door, I see the face of a flower I have never seen before, he said, contemplating Genji with tears in his eyes. He gave Genji a single-pointed vajra to protect him. It's a ritual. The vajra is a ritual implement and a symbol of insight. So a single-pointed vajra looks like this. Fun times. His reverence then gave Genji his own most appropriately selected gifts. A rosary of embellished bo tree seeds obtained by Prince Shotoku from Kudara, still in its original Chinese-style box and presented in a gauze bag attached to a branch of 5-needled pine, and dark blue lapis lazuli jars containing diverse medicines and tied to sprays of wisteria or cherry blossoms. Genji had already sent for the varied gifts, formal and informal, with which to reward the holy man and the other monks who had chanted the scriptures for him, and he now distributed suitable presents to all. Genji had already sent for the varied gifts, formal and informal, with which to reward the holy man and the other monks who had chanted the scriptures for him, and he now distributed suitable presents to all, even the local woodcutters. At last he took his leave, after providing for further chanting of the scriptures. His reverence went into the house and repeated to the nun all that Genji had told him, but her only comment was, "At any rate, we cannot answer him now. If in 4 or 5 years his wish remains unchanged, then perhaps." The reply Genji received therefore only confirmed the nun's opposition. Through a small boy in his reverence's service, he sent, "Now that I have seen faintly the flowers color through the gathering dusk, I can hardly bear to leave while morning mists still rise." To which the nun answered in a casual hand, remarkable for its character and distinction, "Whether it is true you would never wish to leave the flower you prize, that we shall look to discern in the mists of future skies." Genji was entering his carriage when a crowd of young gentlemen from His Excellencies arrived to see him home, complaining that he had simply vanished from among them. The secretary captain, the left controller, and his other brothers-in-law had insisted on coming after him. "We would have gladly accompanied you on a trip like this," the captain said reproachfully, "and it really was not very nice of you to leave us behind. Anyway, it would be a great shame if we were to turn round and start back again without a moment to rest beneath these magnificent blossoms." They all sat together on the moss in the lee of a rock, and the wine cup went round. The tumbling stream beside them made a beautiful cascade. The captain took a flute from the fold of his robe and played, while the left controller sang "Westward from the Toyota Temple," lightly tapping out the rhythm with his fan. These young gentlemen were all certainly splendid, but Genji's peerless, indeed disturbing beauty as he sat leaning against a rock, quite unwell, made it impossible to have eyes for anyone else. One of the secretary captain's company was, as usual, a hichiriki player, while another young man of taste had been entrusted with a show. His reverence brought Genji his own keen. "Do play a little, my lord," he said. "If it pleases you, I should like to give the birds of these mountains a pleasant surprise." Genji protested that he was not feeling himself, but he played enough not to be disobliging. Everyone then set out. The very least of the monks and young servants wept to see him go, while of course the old nuns in the house, who had never seen his like before, assured each other that he could not possibly be of this world at all. His reverence himself exclaimed, wiping tears from his eyes, "Ah, it is sad to think what karma can have got him born with such looks into these latter days, and into this poor land of ours." To the little girl's childish eye, Genji was so splendid that she declared, "He is much better looking than father." What a weird thing to say, girl. "Then why not be his little girl instead?" a gentlewoman suggested. She nodded and seemed very pleased with the idea. Whenever she played with a doll or painted a picture, she pretended that the figure was Lord Genji, dressed it up nicely, and made a great fuss over it. Genji first went to the palace and gave His Majesty an account of all that had happened. His Majesty was dismayed to see him so thin. He inquired about the quality of the holy man, and was sufficiently impressed by Genji's long description to remark, "I believe he deserves elevation to adept. Ah, how strange that he should have lived a life of practice for all these years without ever coming to his sovereign's attention." Just then His Excellency arrived. "I had thought I should at least come out to meet you, but then I reflected that since you had gone so discreetly, I might do better to refrain. Do come and spend a few quiet days with us. I shall accompany you there straight away." Genji had little enthusiasm for this, but he let himself be dragged off. His Excellency invited him into his own carriage and modestly got in behind him. Genji was touched, after all, by his attentions. Reminder, His Excellency is Genji's father-in-law, because Genji has been married this whole time. The household was eagerly awaiting his arrival. His Excellency had had all sorts of things done since Genji's last visit some time ago to make the place grander than ever. His daughter slipped off as always to hide and refused to appear until her father persuaded her at last to come forth, and there she sat, precisely where her gentlewomen placed her, as still and as perfect as a lady in a painting. I could try talking to her about whatever I have on my mind, or tell her about my trip to the mountains, and it would be so nice if only she would then give me some sort of decent response, Genji reflected. But no, she would not unbend, and she remained cold and forbidding. The gulf between them had widened over the years, until he felt provoked to say, "I do wish I might occasionally see you treat me in a normal way. For example, there I was, deathly ill. You did not even ask after my health. Not that this is anything new, I know, but I cannot help feeling hurt." At last she spoke. Was it really so painful to be ignored? She threw him sidelong a chilly glance that accented the stern character of her beauty. "You so seldom speak, but when you do, you say the most extraordinary things. That is hardly our relationship to each other. What a way to talk. I keep trying this and that in the hope that you may change your mind and give up rejecting me all the time. But as far as I can tell, you only dislike me the more. Well, one day, perhaps. He went into their curtained bed, but she did not immediately follow. At a loss for what else to say, he lay down unhappily and proceeded, for he was no doubt feeling thoroughly out of humor, to feign drowsiness, the better to turn over in his mind all the troubles that love had brought him. He was still keen to watch the little plant grow up, but there was a good deal to be said for the nun's opinion that she was far too young. This is such a tricky business on which to approach anyone, he said to himself. What will I have to do to be able to take her home and enjoy her company always? His Highness of War is a decent enough gentleman, but he has nothing in particular to recommend him, so why is she so like her? Because they were both born to the same empress, I suppose. This intimate tie to her made up his mind that he must have her for his own. The next day he sent off letters to the northern hills. The one to his reverence no doubt hinted at his wish. He wrote to the nun, I felt constrained by your distant manner, and unfortunately never managed to say all that I wished. I should be glad if a note such as this were to convince you that there is nothing mild about my hopes, and so on. Inside the letter he placed a little knotted one. That vision of you never leaves me now, O mountain cherry, even though I left behind in your care all of my heart. I worry so about you when the night winds blow. His writing, of course, but even the casual way he had done up the letter, dazzled the eyes of the aging nuns. How very difficult all this is. What reply can I possibly give him? She wrote, I confess that I gave little weight to the kind words that I was privileged to have from you, and now that it has pleased you to return to the matter, I find it difficult to frame a reply. Surely there is no point in pursuing it, since she cannot even write her Kana letters properly yet. After all, just that little while the blossoms cling to the bough on a windswept hill. So long you have left your heart, and such times are quickly gone. I worry about her more and more. His reverence answered in the same vein. The disappointed Genji sent Koremitsu there 2 or 3 days later. The woman they call Nurse Shonagon should be in the house, he said. Find her and have a good talk with her. He never misses a single one, does he? Koremitsu remembered with amusement his own inadequate glimpse of the girl and how very young she had been. His reverence professed deep gratification upon receiving yet another letter. Koremitsu asked to see Shonagon and spent some time with her, telling her what Genji had to say and describing something of Genji's life. He was a great talker, and he made it all sound very convincing, but the little girl was so impossibly young that her guardians remained troubled about what Genji might have in mind. Good reasons. Good guardians, even though I'm pretty sure they're going to bend at some point in time. Genji's letter itself was sincerely felt, and as before it contained a little note. I should still like to see this broken writing of yours. Ah, Mount Asaka, shallow all my love for you that cannot ever be. But why does the face in the spring melt away when I draw near? The nun replied, they tell of a spring such as that one who draws from it knows only regret. Shallow as your waters are, how could they reveal her face? Koremitsu conveyed the same message to Genji. Nurse Shonagon wrote in her own reply, we are soon to move back to my lady's residence in the city as long as her condition improves, and I expect that she will wish to communicate with you further from there. Genji did not find this encouraging. Princess Fujibutsu was not well and had withdrawn from the palace. Genji felt deep sympathy for his majesty, whose anxious desire was evident, but he also anticipated feverishly now at last a chance for himself, and he no longer went out at all. Okay, I was wrong. Fujibutsu is his stepmother. Just to make things more complicated. So she is technically a concubine for the emperor. At the palace or at home, he spent the daylight hours daydreaming, and those after dark hounding Omoyobu. How Omoyobu brought off their meeting is impossible to say, but to poor Genji, even these stolen moments with her seemed quite unreal. To Her Highness, the memory of that last, most unfortunate incident was a source of endless suffering, and she had resolved that nothing of the kind should ever happen again. Yet despite her obvious consternation, she remained thoughtful and kind, even when she continued to resist him with a profound dignity so far beyond the reach of any other woman that Genji could not help wondering in anguish why it was never possible to find in her the slightest flaw. How could he have told her all he had to say? He must have wished himself where darkness never ends. But alas, the nights were short now, and their time together had yielded after all nothing but pain. This much we have shared, but nights when we meet again will be very rare, and now that we live this dream, oh, that it might swallow me, he said, sobbing, to which Her Highness compassionately replied, people soon enough will be passing on our tale, though I let our dreams sweep me on till I forget what misfortune now is mine. Genji could not blame her for being in such torment, and he deeply regretted having caused it. Omoyobu gathered up his dress cloak and so on, and brought it to him. At home again he lay down and wept all day. He gathered that she was refusing as usual to read any letter from him, and although this was indeed her normal practice, the pain of it now all but destroyed him. For 2 or 3 days he remained shut up without even calling at the palace, until His Majesty was moved yet again to concern about what might be wrong that only filled Genji with terror. Her Highness continued to lament the misery of her lot, and meanwhile she began to feel more and more unwell, so that she could not make up her mind to go straight back to the palace, despite a stream of messengers from there urging her to do so. No, she really did not feel herself, and her silent guesses at what this might mean reduced her to despair over what was to become of her. She rose less and less during the summer heat. By the 3rd month, her condition was obvious enough that her women noticed it, and the horror of her fate overwhelmed her. Not knowing what had actually happened, they expressed surprise that she had not yet told His Majesty. She alone understood just what the matter was. Women like Omoyobu or her own foster sister Ben, who attended her immediately when she bathed, who attended her intimately when she bathed, and therefore had before their eyes every clue to her condition, did not doubt that something was seriously wrong, but they could not very well discuss the matter, and Omoyobu was left to reflect in anguish that her mistress's fate had struck after all. To His Majesty, Omoyobu presumably reported that a malevolent spirit had obscured Her Highness's condition, so that at first it had gone unnoticed. This was at any rate what Her Highness's own women believed. His Majesty was deeply concerned about her, and the unbroken procession of messengers from him inspired mingled dread and despair. Genji himself had a dream so strange that he summoned a dream reader. In answer to his questions, he received an interpretation beyond the bounds of all plausibility. I see too, my lord, that you are to suffer a reverse, and that something will require the most urgent caution. Genji was troubled. It is not my own dream. I have only described someone else's. Say not a word about it until it comes true. He was wondering what it all meant when he heard about Her Highness and realized that he probably knew what the matter was. But despite his pleas, now more passionate than ever, Omoyobu was too cowed by fear and guilt to contrive anything for him. His love's rare one-line replies to his letters now stopped altogether. She did not return to the palace until the 7th month. His Majesty, whose love was extraordinary, showed her renewed affection. A new roundness of figure and a face wasted by suffering gave her now a truly peerless beauty. As usual, His Majesty spent all his time in her rooms, and since it was the season for music, he was always summoning Genji to attend him and perform on the keen or the flute. Genji struggled to conceal his feelings, but whenever he failed and betrayed a hint of his torment, Her Highness was overcome, despite her best efforts, by a host of disturbing thoughts. They keep calling it a condition, and I keep thinking she's pregnant, and then it's like, no, it's a wasting sickness, so I'm still not sure. Okay. The nun at the mountain temple had recovered well enough to come down to the city. Genji discovered where she lived and sent her frequent messages. Not unnaturally, her position remained unchanged, and what with the more absorbing sorrows that had overtaken him during the last few months, he had no latitude to think of anything else. Late that autumn, he was feeling very reduced and disheartened. One beautifully moonlit night, he had at last made up his mind to visit a lady he had been seeing in secret when the weather turned and a cold rain began to fall. He was bound for the vicinity of Rokujo and Kyogoku, rather far to his mind since he was coming from the palace, when he caught sight of an unkempt house amid the darkness of ancient trees. That is the house of the late Inspector Grand Counselor, explained Koremitsu, who was with him as always. I happened to call there the other day, and they told me that my lady the nun is very weak now, and they hardly know what to do. What sad news! I really should have called on her before. Why did they not let me know? Do go in and convey my greetings. Koremitsu sent a man to tell the household of Genji's arrival, instructing him to say that Genji had come purposely to call. The man therefore announced when he had entered that his lordship had been pleased to pay them a visit. This is most unfortunate. The women were startled. For days now my lady's health has been a great worry, and she is in no condition to receive him. They could not just send him away, though, so they tidied up the south aisle room and invited him in. This is a most unworthy accommodation, my lord, but my lady wishes at least to thank you. It is unfortunately a very dreary room in which to receive you on so unexpected a visit. Genji agreed that the room was indeed unusual for such an occasion. I have often thought of calling on you, he began, but you've always given me so little hope that in the end I refrained. Your illness, of which I had not heard, troubles me very much. The nun replied, It is very good indeed of you to look in upon me now that I, who have never been a stranger to failing health, am at last nearing my end, and I apologize for not speaking to you myself. Do by all means approach her once she is no longer a child, if it happens that you remain disposed as you are now. I am afraid that leaving her this way without a protector may well hinder my progress on the path I so long to take. She was so near that Genji now and then caught her feeble voice. There is every reason to be grateful for his interest, you know, she was saying. If only our little girl were just old enough to thank him properly. He was moved to answer, but why would I exhibit my immodesty this way if I had only taken a passing fancy to her? There is an unfathomable bond between her and me. You have never spoken to her, Genji. There is an unfathomable bond between her and me, and my heart went out to her the moment I saw her. Indeed, with such uncanny speed that I cannot believe this tie to be from this life alone. And he continued, I understand that any further pleading would be wasted, but if I might possibly just hear the sound of her voice. But, my lord, she does not know you are here, and she is in bed. Just then footsteps approached from the depths of the house, and a little girl's voice called, Grandma, they say Lord Genji is here, the gentleman at the mountain temple. Why are you not looking at him? Hush, said the shocked women. But she said seeing him made her feel so much better. This was welcome news, but in consideration for the women's embarrassment, Genji pretended, despite his pleasure, not to have heard, and he brought his visit to a correct conclusion before leaving. Yes, he thought, she really is just a little girl, but I will teach her properly. Weird vibes, still. The next day he sent the nun a courteous note with, as usual, a smaller one tightly folded inside it. Ever since these ears listened to that single cry from the little crane, I have despaired that my boat should be caught among the reeds. And ever to that same love. He had purposefully written in a youthful hand, so appealing that all the gentlewomen urged the little girl to put it straight into her copybook. Shonagon composed the reply, The lady you visited seems unlikely to live many days longer, and she will therefore move presently to the temple in the mountains. She will wish to thank you for your kind letter, even if she can no longer do so in this life. Genji was deeply moved. His thoughts would turn of an autumn evening to the one who so constantly stirred his heart, and he surely thirsted more than ever for any relation of hers. He remembered that evening when the nun spoke of being unable to let the little plant go, and he yearned for her, although he also felt a pang of apprehension that if he did have her, she might disappoint him. And he murmured, How glad I would be to pick and soon to make mine that little wild plant sprung up from the very root shared by the Murasaki. In the 10th month, His Majesty was to make a progress to the Suzaku Palace. He had chosen as dancers those sons of the greatest houses, senior nobles or privy gentlemen who showed any aptitude for such things, and everyone from the princes and ministers on down was busy rehearsing his part. Genji remembered how long it had been since his last correspondence with the lady in the mountains, and he sent a messenger there. The only answer he received was from his reverence, who wrote, She breathed her last on the 20th of last month in my presence, and although death comes to us all, hers is a very great loss. And so on. Genji felt the frailty of life sharply as he read it, and he wondered anxiously how the little girl whose future had so worried her was now getting on. Young as she was, did she miss her grandmother? He remembered losing his own mother, if only dimly, and he took care to keep in touch with her. The replies he had from Shonagon were not unsympathetic. Once he heard that this morning confinement was over, and the household was back in the city, he let some time go by, and then went in person one quiet night to call. It was a depressing, ruinous place, all but deserted, and he could easily imagine how it might frighten a child. He was shown into the same room as before, and there the weeping Shonagon described to him how the end had come for her mistress until her own sleeves were wet with tears. I gather that she is to go to his highness's, Shonagon went on, but her mother always hated the cruelty she suffered there, and my mistress herself believed that although the child was certainly not a baby, at her awkward age, among all her father's other children, she might well be treated more as a nuisance than anything else, since she does not yet understand very well what is expected of her. There is good reason, in fact, to believe that my mistress was right, and at a time like this we should therefore welcome the interest you have been kind enough to express, however casual it may be, and not insist too much on gauging your future feelings towards her. Even so, my lord, we are perplexed about what to do, because she is hopelessly unsuited to you, and is actually even more of a child than she should be at her age. I guess I'm forgetting that Genji was married off at 13. So with that in mind, 10 doesn't seem as bad, but it is still pretty bad. But why must you be so reluctant to accept the assurances that I have already given you repeatedly? That her very childishness should attract me suggests, it's bad. For I can make no other sense of it, that the tie between her and me really is unusual. I should like to tell her so, not indirectly, but in person. Perhaps the young reed, when she grows on Waka shore, is for no one yet, but, say, now the wave is high, can it slip back into the sea? That would not do at all. Nor would I presume to ask it of you, my lord. Should the gleaming reed on Waka shore lean to meet the approaching wave, never knowing what he means, hers, no doubt, would be light waves. How difficult this is. Genji partly forgave her for thwarting him, since she spoke with a thoughtfulness born of experience. Why does that day never come, he sang to himself, dazzling the younger gentlewomen. The little girl was lying down, crying for her grandmother, when her playmates exclaimed, "A gentleman is here in a dress cloak. It must be his highness." She got up and called, "Shonagon, where is the gentleman in the dress cloak? Is father here?" Her voice as she approached was very sweet. "No," Genji said, "I am not his highness. But that does not mean that you should not like me, too. Come here." She recognized the voice of the gentleman who had overawed her, and she regretted having spoken. Instead, she went straight to her nurse. "Come," she said, "I am sleepy." "Why are you still hiding from me? Sleep on my lap, then. Do come a little closer." You see how little she understands yet at her age, my lord. Shonagon propelled her towards him. The little girl sat down innocently, and he reached under the blind to touch her. He felt a delicious abundance when his hand came to the end of her tresses, which spilled richly over her soft clothing, and he imagined the beauty of her hair. Next he took her hand, at which she bridled to have a stranger so close, and drew back, complaining to Shonagon, "But I want to go to sleep." He slipped straight in after her. "But I am the one who is going to love you now. Be nice to me." "My lord, what are you doing?" Shonagon was appalled. "Oh dear me, I assure you, it does not matter how you talk to her. You will get nothing from her at all. What do I care if she is still only a little girl? Just wait and see how much I love her, more than anyone ever." Hail was coming down hard, and it promised to be a bad night. "How can you live all by yourselves like this when there are so few of you?" Genji began to weep. He could not possibly leave them. "Lower the lattice shutters. This looks to be an unpleasant night, and I mean to protect you. Gather near me, all of you." With this, he strode into the little girl's curtained bed as though it were the most natural thing in the world, leaving the shocked and astonished gentlewomen rooted to the spot. Shonagon could not very well intervene with a sharp reproof, despite her anxiety, and she only sat there sighing. The girl began to shiver with fright, and Genji, his heart melting to find her lovely skin so chilly, wrapped her in another shift. He knew perfectly well how outrageously he was behaving, but he began nonetheless to talk to her gently about things he thought might catch her fancy. "Come with me, and I will take you to where there are lots of pretty pictures, and you can play with dolls." He spoke so kindly that in her childish way she stopped being quite so afraid, but she never relaxed enough to sink into a sound sleep, and she continued to toss and turn. The wind roared all night long, while the gentlewomen whispered among themselves, "It's true, you know, we would have been miserable without him. Oh, if only she were old enough for him." The anxious Shonagon stayed very close to her charge. Genji left before daybreak, once the wind had dropped a little, looking quite pleased with himself. "She was already constantly on my mind," he said, "and now I shall worry more than ever. I want to take her to where I myself spend my dreary nights and days. She cannot go on this way. It is a wonder she was not frightened half to death." "His Highness seems to be talking about having her come to live with him as well," Shonagon answered. "I suppose he means to do it after my lady's 49 days are over. I am sure he will look after her, but he must be as much of a stranger to her as I am." That doesn't make it better. Genji, that doesn't make it better. "She has never lived with him after all. I myself have only just come to know her, but even so I have no doubt that I am more attached to her than he." He stroked her hair, and he looked back at her many times as he left the house. The sky, thick with fog, was unusually lovely, and all was white with frost, a scene to please the replete lover, but for Genji not quite enough. He remembered that someone he had been visiting secretly lived on his way, and he had a man of his knock at her gate. No one heard. He was reduced to having an attendant with a good voice sing twice over, "By the dawn's first light, while rising mists shroud the skies and confuse the gaze, I just cannot bring myself to pass by my darling's gate." At this, a nice-looking servant woman came out and replied, "If it is so hard to pass straight on by a gate just glimpsed through the mist, surely its flimsy portal need not really bar your way." Then she went back in. No one came out again. He had no wish to retreat, but he felt exposed under the lightning sky, and he went on his way. He lay smiling to himself in fond recollection of that delightful little girl. The sun was high by the time he arose to write the customary letter, and what he had to say was so unusual that he often laid down his brush and simply dreamed. With the letter, he sent some pretty pictures. As it happened, this was the day when His Highness came to see his daughter. The house had deteriorated remarkably in recent years, and its being so big and old made it even more forbiddingly lonely. How could a child spend a moment living in a place like this? He contemplated the scene before him. "I must bring her home with me. There is no reason why you should be uncomfortable here. You will have your nurse, who will have a room of her own, and there are children for you to play with. You should be perfectly happy." He had her come to him, and he caught the delicious scent her clothing had picked up from Genji's. "What a lovely smell," he exclaimed, only to add ruefully, "Your clothes are all limp, though." He went on, "What a pity she spends all those years with an old and ailing lady. I have urged her to come and get to know my household, but for some reason she's resisted the idea, and actually there has been some reluctance at my house as well. I am sorry she must move there at a time like this. But must she really, Your Highness? This house is certainly lonely for her, but she ought to stay a while longer. Surely it would be better for her to move after she has grown up a little more. She always misses her grandmother, and she will not eat." It was true, too. The little girl was painfully thin, although this only gave her looks a more enchanting grace. This is a soap opera, but yeah, wild. "But why are you so upset? His Highness hoped to make her feel better. Your grandmother is gone and no mourning will bring her back. You have me after all." It's a really rude thing to say. Rude thing to say. The babies are in danger. When evening came and His Highness prepared to leave, the little girl was so unhappy that she cried. Tears sprang to his eyes as well. Now, you must not be so sad," he said comfortingly over and over again. "I shall have you come to me very soon." When he was gone, she wept inconsolably. What life might hold in store for her concerned her not at all. She knew only that the lady she had been with every moment through the years was now no more, and child though she was, the pain of her loss consumed her. She no longer played as she used to, and if she forgot during the day, night returned her to her misery. Her women wondered how she could go on living this way, and they did all they could to comfort her, only to fail and burst into tears themselves. Towards evening, Genji sent Koremitsu to the house with the message, "I should come myself, but unfortunately His Majesty has summoned me. I was distressed to see her situation, and now it worries me very much." Koremitsu was to guard the house. "This is too awful of him," Shonagon said. "It is a game to him, I'm sure, but what a thing to do at the very start. If His Highness were to hear of it, he would accuse us in her service of sheer folly. Do not forget, you must never be foolish enough to give him any hint of what has happened." Alas, to the little girl, none of this meant anything at all. Shonagon remarked while recounting their woes to Koremitsu, "When she is older, I doubt that she will escape the destiny he intends for her, but for the moment his proposition seems to me hopelessly unsuitable. In fact, I cannot even imagine what he means by all the extraordinary things he says. I do not know what to do. Just today His Highness was here, warning us to make sure that he need not worry about her, and to keep a proper eye on her at all times. I hardly know which way to turn, and now I worry far more than before about the liberties someone might take with her." Shonagon refrained from complaining too pointedly, because she did not wish to give Koremitsu ideas. Koremitsu himself could not make out what she was talking about. See, one thing I appreciate is all the women around this girl are like, "This is weird. This is weird. You should stop. This is weird. Please stop." Not that it's going to stop Genji, because Genji has not learned his lesson. Genji felt Shonagon's predicament keenly when Koremitsu returned and told him what he had heard, but the thought of visiting her regularly still upset him, because if people learned what he was up to, they would certainly condemn his dubious eccentricity, and that idea did not appeal to him at all. No, it shouldn't. because it's very, very close to pedophilia. So, no. No, he decided he would take her home. That's not better. He sent repeated notes and dispatched Koremitsu there after sundown, as before, to say that he hoped they would not take it amiss if certain difficulties prevented him from coming in person. We are very busy now because we've just heard from His Highness that he suddenly plans to take her to his residence tomorrow, Shonagon explained. I hate, after all, to leave this tumble-down old place where I've lived so long, and the others are upset, too. She had little more to say and seemed preoccupied only with her sewing. Koremitsu returned to Genji. Genji was at His Excellency's, but the lady there refused as usual to receive him. He toyed in frustration with a wagon and sang to himself in a pleasant voice, "In Hitachi here I've my field to hoe." Then Koremitsu arrived. Genji called him in and asked for his news. Koremitsu's report alarmed him. If she went to her father's, any attempt to remove her from there would appear indecent, and he would be accused of having abducted an innocent child. Well, it wouldn't be the first time, would it, Genji? No, he would have to silence her women for the time being and take her before that could happen. That's also kidnapping. That's also kidnapping. I shall go there before daybreak, he announced. The carriage will do very well as it is, and I shall want you to bring 1 or 2 men. Koremitsu left to do as he asked. Genji now wavered, reflecting anxiously that if anyone found out, he would be considered debauched. Yes. That a man would look normal in comparison if people assumed that the woman involved had been old enough to know what it was and he had acted in concert with him, and that he would have no excuse for himself when His Highness discovered the truth. But despite this whirl of misgivings, he could not let the opportunity pass. Maybe you should. Maybe you should, Genji. Maybe you should listen to those little nagging sensations in your brain telling you this is not a good idea. But despite this whirl of misgivings, he could not let the opportunity pass, and he therefore prepared to leave while the night was still dark. His lady was displeased as always, and she had no forgiveness for him. I wouldn't either. This is my husband who is going to abduct a child because I'm apparently not nice enough to him. Yeah, we love women's wrongs here. I would appreciate it if she did something. You see, I just remembered something urgent I must go back and look after. I shall not be gone long. Not even her women knew it when he left. In his own room, he donned a dress cloak, and then he drove off with only Koremitsu riding beside him. He had a man of his knock at the gate, and a servant who knew nothing opened it. He ordered his carriage quietly brought inside. Koremitsu then rapped at the double doors and cleared his throat. Shonagon came out when she recognized his voice. His lordship is here, he announced. But she is asleep. He seems to be out very late. She took it for granted that Genji was on his way home from elsewhere. I hear she is to move to her father's, and I have something to tell her before she goes, Genji explained. What in the world could it be? Shonagon smiled. And how could she possibly give you a proper answer? To her dismay, he came straight in. But there are unsightly old women just lying about in here. I suppose she is still asleep. Come, I shall get her up. There is no excuse for sleeping through such a beautifully misty dawn. He went in through her curtains. There was no time even for them to cry out. The little girl was lying there, oblivious to everything. Genji put his arms around her to wake her, and when she woke up, she was still so sleepy that she took him for her father come to fetch her. She did not realize her mistake until Genji tidied her hair and said, "Come, up, I am here now from His Highness." And in her surprise, she took fright. Now, I might just as well be your father, he said. Weird vibes, re-emerging with her in his arms. My lord, what are you doing? Taifu, Shonagon, and the others cried. I have already told her I want to take her where I can be more comfortable with her, because I do not like being unable to come here often. And now, you see, I learned to my consternation that she is to move to her father's, which will make it even harder for me to keep in touch with her. I want one of you to come with me. My lord, the distraught Shonagon answered, today is just not the day for this. What would you have us tell His Highness when he comes? Everything will surely work in the fullness of time if you are to have what you wish. But as it is, you have not left us a moment to think, and you are putting us all in an impossible position. Very well, someone may come and join her later. With this, to their utter amazement, he had his carriage brought up. She was alarmed and crying. Shonagon, who could do nothing to stop him, changed into better clothes and got into the carriage, carrying the things she had been sewing the evening before. Nijo was not far away, and the carriage reached it before daylight. Genji had it drawn up to the west wing and alighted. He easily lifted her down in his arms. Shonagon hesitated. I still feel as though I am dreaming. What would you like me to do? Whatever you please. Now that I have brought your young mistress here, I will see you home again if you want. With a wry smile, Shonagon stepped out of the carriage too. The suddenness of it all had dazed her, and her heart was pounding. She wept to think of His Highness's displeasure, of her charge's perilous future, and above all of the child's pathetic plight now that she had lost all those who could claim her trust. But she mastered her feelings as well as she could, despite her tears, so as not to blight this moment with ill-omened grief. The wing lacked a curtained bed and other such furnishings, since Genji did not live in it. He summoned Koremitsu and had him put one up, together with screens and so on. Apart from that, there was no need to do more than let down the standing curtains and tidy the place up a little. He sent to the east wing for nightclothes and lay down. The little girl wondered fearfully what he might have in mind for her, but she managed to keep from sobbing aloud. I want to sleep with Shonagon, she declared in a childish tone. No, Genji was firm. That is not the way you are to sleep anymore. She lay down, weeping with unhappiness. Her nurse, who could not sleep at all, sat up in a daze. Looking around as day came on, Shonagon was overwhelmed not only by the opulence of the building and its furnishings, but even by the sand in the garden, which resembled a bed of jewels and seemed to give off light, and she began to feel like an intruder, even though no other women were actually present. Only household guards were stationed outside of the blinds, since Genji lodged no more than the occasional guest here. One of them had heard that Genji had just brought a lady home. Who can she be, he whispered. He must be extremely keen on her. Washing water and breakfast were brought in. The sun was high when Genji arose. She will need her gentlewomen, he said to Shonagon. This evening she must call for the ones she prefers. He sent off to the east wing for some children. I especially want little ones, he added. So it was that 4 very pretty little girls appeared. She was lying wrapped in a shift, and he insisted that she get up. You must not be so unfriendly, he said. Would I be looking after you this way if you did not mean a great deal to me? A woman should be sweet and obedient. Lies. And so began her education. Yeah, it begins with a kidnapping. That's a great way to start this education, Genji. Nothing could go wrong with this. You stole a child. She looked prettier than ever here. Genji chatted disarmingly with her, showing her all sorts of nice paintings and toys that he had brought from the east wing, and doing all he could to please her. At last she got up and looked properly at what he was showing her. She made such an engaging picture in her layering of soft dark gray, wreathed in innocent smiles, that Genji found himself smiling too as he watched her. With Genji off to the east wing, she went for a look at the park's lake and trees. The near garden, now touched by frost, was as pretty as a painting, and the unfamiliar whirl of 4th and 5th rank gentlemen bustling in and out convinced her that she had come to a very nice place. In no time she was happily distracted by the fascinating pictures on the screens. At least she still has Shonagon with her. Who knows this is weird? Genji did not go to court for 2 or 3 days. He devoted himself instead to making her feel at home. He wrote or painted all sorts of things to show her, no doubt with the thought of making them up for her straight away into a book, and he turned them into an extremely attractive collection. She took out an exceptionally beautiful Talk of Musashi Plain Arouses My Complaint that he had written on Murasaki-colored paper, and he had added in smaller writing, Her root is unseen, and yet I do love her so, the kin to that plant, the dews of Musashi Plain put so far beyond my reach. Come now, he said, you write one, but I do not know how to write very well yet. She looked up at him with the most engaging artlessness. He smiled. Still, you cannot write nothing at all. I shall teach you. Her manner of turning away to write and the childish way she held her brush so entranced him that he wondered at himself. Oh, I made a mistake. She tried in embarrassment to hide what she had written, but he insisted on having a look. Why you should complain I have not the least idea, and that troubles me. Who then is the kin you mean, and what plant have you in mind? The generous lines of her letters were certainly immature, but they showed great promise. Her hand closely resembled the late nun's. It seemed to him that she would soon write beautifully, as long as she had an up-to-date copybook. As far as dolls went, he made her one dollhouse after another, and he found his games with her the perfect distraction from his cares. For the women who had not come with her, it was acutely embarrassing to have nothing to say when His Highness arrived and wanted to know what had become of his daughter. Genji had warned them to keep the secret for the time being, and Shonagon, who agreed, had insisted that they remain silent. They told His Highness only that Shonagon had taken his daughter off to hide her. They did not know where. He was obliged to assume that since the late nun had never approved of sending him her granddaughter, The girl's nurse had taken it upon herself in excess of zeal to jeopardize her charge's whole future by spiriting her away instead of objecting openly, and he returned to his residence in tears. "Please let me know if you ever have any news of her," he said, to their intense discomfort. He also made fruitless inquiries at the residence of his reverence. He was sorry to have lost so remarkably attractive a daughter. Oh, that's the only reason you're sad about losing her? That you're not better. And he continued to miss her. Even his wife was disappointed, since her antipathy towards the girl's mother had faded by now, and she had been looking forward to making the most of her authority. Also weird. You know, Murasaki really had no good options here. By and by, the gentlewomen gathered around their young mistress. Her playmates, young girls in service as page, or even smaller ones, gladly lost themselves in games with so striking and stylish a pair. The young lady might still cry for her grandmother on evenings when her friend was away and she was lonely, but she retained no special memory of her father. Never having been used to living with him anyway, she now cared only for this second father, to whom she became deeply attached. She would always go straight to greet him when he came home, chatting prettily and snuggling into his arms, and she was never in the least reserved or bashful with him. As far as that sort of thing went, she was as sweet with him as she could possibly be. A woman may be so querulous and so quick to make an issue of the smallest lapse that the man takes a dislike for her, fearing that whatever he does may unleash bitter reproaches, until an estrangement that neither had wished for becomes a reality, but not so for Genji with his delightful companion. No daughter by the time she reached this age can be as free with her father, sleep so intimately beside him, or rise so blithely with him in the morning, as this young lady did with Genji, until Genji himself must have wondered at being able to lavish his affection on so rare a treasure. Weird vibes for the whole chapter. So once again, Genji does a kidnapping twice. Let's see how it turns out this time. But either way, that's the end of this chapter of Genji. Next week we'll be taking a break from this, and there will be some adult story time with Emily. So tune in to see some picture books that are good for adults as well as kids. And like I said earlier, this video will go up on our YouTube channel on Thursday, and our previous chapters are up there as well. So thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you next time for more Tale of Genji. Have a great rest of your day. Bye!